All right, welcome everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome everyone here with us today. My name is Sunny Kim. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Harriman Institute of Columbia University. Today we have the second session of the speaker series, The Rule of Law in Autocracy, the Legal Dimension of Russian Politics. The speaker series invite 5 prominent scholars whose expertise on judiciary, lawmaking, and law enforcement in authoritarian politics, such as in Russia and other post-communist states. For more information about the event and the speakers' topics and the event date, you can visit the Harriman Institute website. Today, as usual, the speaker will talk about her research for about 30 minutes, and then we will move on to the discussion and Q&A session. If you want to add any comments or questions, you can use the Zoom chat room function, or if you're joining us from YouTube, you can also leave comments there. I'll be gathering the questions and moderating the questions at the end. All right, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lauren McCarthy. Dr. Lauren McCarthy is an associate professor of legal studies and political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and director of legal studies. Her main focus of research is on the relationship between law and society in Russia and law enforcement institutions and police, civilian oversight, and the issue of human trafficking in Russia. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. McCarthy for her presentation. Thank you for joining us here today. The floor is yours, Dr. McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Sanyi. I'm going to share my screen. I'm still working out. I should know and have worked out all of my kinks by now on Zoom, but I still haven't. So I just want to say thank you to everyone, to the Harriman Institute for inviting me to participate, to Sanyi for organizing such an incredible lineup of speakers, which I'm very honored and privileged to be a part of, and to Carly Jackson for organizing everything behind the scenes, which we're always really appreciative of, particularly in Zoom world that we now inhabit. So my talk today is going to focus on the issue of citizen oversight of the police. And it's part of a broader book project that I'm working on about oversight and accountability in the legal system in Russia. But since the focus of the lecture series is on exploring the connection between authoritarianism and the rule of law, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the role of the police in authoritarian regimes and their importance for authoritarian resilience. So just a quick note of clarification. When I'm talking about the police in this broader context, I mean both the agencies of law enforcement that are focused on things like everyday criminal control and the criminal justice system, and also the more elite security services, which are focused on the broader issues of social order and high-level domestic intelligence. Both of these kinds of security services are important to supporting and protecting an authoritarian state. And the talk is far too short to take a tour through all of the agencies in Russia that perform these functions and to explain what they do and their relationships to one another. But I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the kinds of agencies that I'm talking about when I'm talking about law enforcement in an authoritarian regime. So the Ministry of Internal Affairs is the sort of day-to-day police. The investigative committee does all the investigations. The procuracy oversees the entire legal system. And the rest of the agencies are focused more on the national level with regard, and they're the ones I'm kind of calling elite agencies and elite security services, social order, and domestic intelligence. So we know very well that authoritarian regimes rely on their police forces to prevent popular uprising and instability and to safeguard the regime's interests. And this tends to be what we focus on when we think about the importance of the police and other security services for authoritarian resilience. More recent research in authoritarian contexts has started to focus on the role of the agencies of everyday law enforcement in maintaining authoritarian stability. Yes, these agencies are sometimes called on to suppress protests, and their investigative and prosecutorial work is really critical in when demonstrators, for example, are being fined or imprisoned for criminal or administrative violations. But on a more mundane level, these everyday law enforcement agencies are really important to an authoritarian regime as well. because even the most successful authoritarian regimes still have to provide a basic level of safety and security to their populations. They have to engage in managing and preventing crime. And that's what these law enforcement agencies do. We also know from countries around the world, including our own, that dissatisfaction with everyday policing can be a source of frustration for the public and even a driver of protests, as we saw in the United States last summer. So ultimately, authoritarian regimes have to walk the fine line between keeping the loyalty of law enforcement and the security services, while also responding to popular calls for police reform and keeping misbehavior in check. So this is sort of the relationship that I see between authoritarian regimes and the police in the broadest possible strokes. So turning a little bit to the theme of my talk, I'd like to propose that striking this balance between loyalty and accountability is precisely why authoritarian regimes might be willing to allow some kind of police oversight, even in the context of the broader crackdown on civil society that we're seeing in Russia today. And so I want to highlight 4 ways that I think that this can happen, and 4 ways that I think oversight can actually be useful to an authoritarian state. So the first is as a signaling mechanism. No matter how monolithic an authoritarian state is, it simply can't oversee the giant bureaucracies that it creates to maintain order and prevent crime. With too few resources and too much to watch, they may find some advantage in allowing oversight by citizens as a signaling mechanism to show the state and its bureaucratic agencies where things are going wrong. This is particularly important in an authoritarian regime because it then allows for the actual oversight resources of the state to be used in other ways. So on things that the regime considers more threatening, like popular unrest. Another reason that an authoritarian regime might allow oversight is to make an example of people. Agencies and institutions that are plagued by corruption problems and mistrust from the public, as many of Russia's are, may actually find value in selectively exposing cases of misconduct, particularly at the lower levels where most ordinary people tend to experience police misconduct and corruption. And at the same time, this allows them to reinforce their own claims that they're working towards accountability and as this sort of outward signaling mechanism to the population that they're listening to their concerns. In addition, police-friendly organizations that provide oversight can actually be really helpful to the police in outsourcing some functions. So if you talk to police, they really tell you that they care the most and their job is really the most focused on controlling and preventing crime. That means that they feel that these additional things like talking to the public, PR, all these sorts of community outreach things are less the core of their mission and more of things that they kind of just have to do. And so when you have these trusted oversight organizations, and I'll talk about these in a little bit, you can actually end up with the police having the ability to outsource things like PR and community outreach to trusted individuals who are theoretically performing oversight in these institutions. And finally, though we don't often give the Russian state a lot of credit for this, there is an active interest in making policing better, building trust with the population and increasing their legitimacy. They do care about their reputation. And this has been part of the sort of pillars of reform that they've always put forward. Again, how much their commitment to this is in practice is another question. But this is particularly true now that since 2011 and the police reform law, they are obligated to collect data on public opinion about their work. And that is being used now as an assessment tool for police work. More pragmatically, police need the public to do some of their very basic tasks like crime control and maintaining social order. They can't solve a crime if it's not reported and if witnesses don't come forward. And so some level of engagement with the population is important and necessary, and that's more likely in an environment where there's increased trust and the people believe that the police are doing an effective job. So there is some pragmatic reason to potentially allow oversight to improve the institution itself. So I wanted, before this, I sound too rosy and optimistic here, I should add a caveat, which is that the benefits of these oversight activities only outweigh the risks for the state insofar as the state maintains its ability to control the oversight if need be. And we've all seen the sophisticated and sometimes troubling ways that the state has developed repertoires to push back against activity that they find problematic. So some of these include active repression of individuals participating in civic activism, usually through legal cases, but sometimes through harsher means. We have seen the creation of excessive barriers to entry to state-organized, state-based oversight organizations, for example, prohibiting any individuals who are on the foreign agent list from participating, or on the foreign agent list or work for a foreign agent listed organization from participating in state-based organizations, and legislating entire activities out of existence. So for example, requiring that all societal oversight be channeled through official state bodies. So these tactics have all presented obstacles that would-be overseers have had to find their way around, often through a variety of creative tactics. So before I turn to those creative tactics, I just want to talk a little bit about what we traditionally think of when we think of oversight. So the traditional forms of oversight and accountability, when we think about these, we usually think about formal accountability institutions like civilian review boards, police commissions, ombudspeople, or something like that. We might also think of the role that courts can play in holding police accountable for misconduct, or the role that internal disciplinary processes that happen within law enforcement institutions themselves can play in holding law enforcement accountable. Russia has all of these institutions too. And here's a list of the many possible places that someone could take a complaint of police misconduct. I'm not going to talk about them all, but I do want to highlight the one that's sort of most concretely police focused, which are the police public councils. These exist nationally, regionally, and sometimes even locally in towns and cities, and really started to develop nationwide after the police reform law of 2011 made public oversight a part of policing in a way that it had never been legally recognized before. So based on previous research, which I'll very quickly summarize here, we found that public police councils are often called window dressing and performance of accountability, and to some extent that's true. They work within the state's framework to offer constructive criticism about how the state should improve. And this is part of the broader move in civil society in Putin's Russia to sort of bring civil society to heel and to use them pragmatically to offer this kind of constructive criticism, but not sort of outright criticism. They tend to hand select representatives from civil society who are very prominent in their fields, but who are also useful to what the police are trying to do. For example, there's a lot of media people on these public police councils, and there's a lot of people like priests. And so a lot of the kinds of things that they do really do support the state goals, and they use these people to do those kinds of things. So for example, the priests are often on committees that promote traditionalism and patriotism through moral, patriotic, and spiritual education. The media people are often on committees that are focused on improving the relationship in the media to the police, of the public and the police. But these organizations also do some functions that are very useful to the police and to the public more generally. So they do education about crime prevention. They work on pothole issues. As we all know, that's a big thing in Russia. And they work to facilitate trust in the police through these kinds of community outreach and media. So, you know, I would say that window dressing is not quite the right thing, but they do fit very neatly within the sort of managed civil society that the Putin regime prefers. All of these other organizations that I've listed here are other ways within the state that one could bring a complaint of police misconduct and that could perform oversight. As elsewhere, courts also provide a mechanism for legal accountability, convicting police if they abuse their power or participate in illegal activities. But much like in countries around the world, including the United States, this hasn't been a particularly successful accountability mechanism. As you can see from some of the data from these reports, Novaya Gazeta collected data on how many police officers over a 10-year period were convicted of abuse of power. It was about 4,000 total over that entire 10 years. Zona Prava has looked into how many police per year are convicted of falsifying evidence, also a criminal offense, and it's about 50 in that same 10-year period, most of whom were given probationary sentences. On the other hand, there are some amazingly dogged human rights organizations that have been working on these issues, abuse of police, prison guards, et cetera, trying to hold them accountable legally and to gain compensation. And these organizations, like the two whose logos I have here, Общественный Verdict, Public Verdict in Moscow, and Человек и Закон, Man and Law in Mariel, are two of many others that have worked to bring cases of police misconduct to the domestic courts and also to international courts like the European Court of Human Rights. So these are the kind of more traditional forms of oversight that we think of when we think of civilian oversight of the police. What's more interesting to me, and what I'd like to sort of move into talking about now, is the more grassroots forms of oversight. And I think this is a trend that we're seeing worldwide. And we've certainly seen it in the United States, and we've seen it elsewhere. Grassroots accountability mechanisms have as their primary aim involving a broader swath of the population into exercising control over the police. And as we've seen from the hundreds of cell phone videos in the US, Russia, and elsewhere, technology has really given us new ways to document and report police misconduct. But it's also importantly given us ways to streamline reporting and cut through bureaucratic red tape, which those of you who study Russia know is kind of a thing. So open government laws in Russia have required Russian agencies, including law enforcement, to increase their transparency and responsiveness. And activists have found really creative ways to leverage these new developments to perform oversight. So I'd like to take a little bit of time and talk about several of these grassroots oversight initiatives. So the first is monitoring. The basic strategy in monitoring is to take the laws governing whatever agency you're monitoring and to turn them into a checklist, and then to send people to see whether or not the officials are following the law. So for police, this involves looking at the police law and internal regulations, ordering the police, and then making it into a checklist, going to a police station and seeing, is there a phone number that you can call if there has been police misconduct? Is there a pen and paper available if you'd like to write a complaint, et cetera, et cetera? Is there a handicapped ramp? Is there good lighting? Can you access a toilet? All of these really mundane and basic things. They then compile reports about the deficiencies that they observe and send them to the relevant agencies, which, as I mentioned before, are obligated by law to respond in some way. Some monitoring campaigns take this a step further and actually lodge an official complaint with one of the state-based agencies that I mentioned before. But all of these, I think what's common about all of these activities is that they take place according to state established policies and procedures. And monitoring is really based on this underlying approach that's common in many authoritarian regimes of taking the state at its word, basically saying, look, you people have created these laws, you expect us to abide by them, so you also have to abide by them. And I would say that these tactics are particularly well suited to monitoring Russian police, which is really steeped in bureaucratic regulations and is staffed by people whose quantitative indicators are closely monitored from above. So as you can see from this list, monitoring has taken place in a variety of ways. The organization that's doing most of this and coordinating most of this is the Agon, which is a group of ordinary citizens who have come together to do these kinds of monitoring campaigns, and Moscow Helsinki Group, which has done an organized citizen and police oversight initiative that has slowed down in the past years. So they focus on looking at badges, IDs to make sure that police are wearing them. This is a requirement in the police reform law of 2011, and also helps with accountability. If police commits misconduct, police officer commits misconduct and you can't identify them, you can't report the misconduct. So this is sort of a basic level of accountability. Once a year, there is a day or week of police station visits and checks. This is when they take their checklist and go. They also observe law enforcement behavior at protests. There are other organizations that work on observing traffic police. And there's sort of the most basic, where you actually just observe the outside of a building to see if it complies with the law. So you can see the picture here of the outside of a procuracy building. And it's basically a question of, is there the correct number of flags? Is there a no smoking sign? And checking those off a list, taking photographic evidence and sending that in if there's some kind of violation. So another form of oversight that's happening at the grassroots is complaint generators. So these have appeared all over the internet, and they provide templates for communications with various government agencies, including the police, for all sorts of situations, common and uncommon. And this is really a grassroots mechanism for overcoming the kind of bureaucratic hurdles that people often run into when trying to engage with government agencies in the Russian context, and getting around the problem of having a complaint rejected on a technicality or being redirected to another agency because this is, quote, not our problem. I think the most interesting work in this area is being done by the organization OVD Info, which does a ton of other stuff too, but I'm going to focus in on two of their complaint generators that have been really successful over the past several years. So the first and most recent is their woodpecker generator. This they deployed after the Navalny protests, and really in response to two issues. One, the massive detentions and the violations of detainees' rights that happened. So things as basic as people have to be served a hot meal after a certain number of hours. They have to be able to go to the bathroom after a certain number of hours. And they've created basically a checklist, which you can see I've just taken a little screenshot of here, where people can go on to the woodpecker generator and check off the things. They fill out a bunch of other information, and the generator generates a complaint that can then be sent to the appropriate organization. The other thing that the woodpecker generator documents is the police cracking down on people being allowed to see their lawyers while they've been detained, particularly after protests. And this has largely been accomplished through what is called the Plan Krepus, the Fortress Plan, which was originally meant to be able to shut down any individual police station if there was some kind of terrorist threat. So it would be nobody in, nobody out. And instead, what the state has done is in the large cities, in particular Moscow and to some extent St. Petersburg, has just declared that all of the stations are under the Fortress Plan and that no lawyers and nobody can come in or go out of those things. And so people who've been detained are not allowed access to their lawyers, which is also a violation of Russian law. OVD Info has also completed an European Court of Human Rights complaint generator, which prompts potential litigants to upload all of their documents, to fill out a narrative, and it presents the information at the end in a format that the European Court of Human Rights finds acceptable and won't reject on a technicality. So this has really been sort of a grassroots effort to overcome some of the bureaucratic hurdles that people face when trying to take their cases to the ECHR. And this came out of protests spanning all the way back to 2017 that OVD Info has been involved in helping people with their legal cases. And so all of these, they've sent, their goal was to send, I think, 7,000 complaints to the ECHR to sort of prompt the ECHR to note that there was a broader problem in Russia having to do with protest detentions and freedom of assembly. And sort of, I've thrown a bunch of other oversight activities onto this page, just as kind of so you can have a broad sense of the other kinds of things that are happening in Russia. We have numerous organizations that have worked on providing information and making information easy to access and transparent and available. So one organization, policemap.ru, has created a police station map with like Yelp reviews for police stations. So not only does it give the information if you need to go to a police station, where do you go? It also has, it also gives a sense of how people are being treated at those police stations. And its long-term goal, when last I talked to the organizers, was to also integrate some of the monitoring and oversight work and conclusions into the police map. So people would have a sense of like, what is your local police station up to? We have a ton of Know Your Rights trainings and publications. I've sort of given one example here. What do I do if a police officer approaches me? There have been, full sort of manuals of how to do your own legal defense if you need to, in cases of police misconduct, or in particular after protest detentions. These all sort of fall under the broad category of information provision. We also have a ton of social media and media exposure. In Russia, individuals have shot dash cam footage and cell phone footage of police roughing up protesters, torturing prisoners in temporary detention facilities, or asking for bribes during traffic stops. And these get posted on a variety of social media and occasionally can lead to accountability, but at the very least is sort of a form of oversight. And they go on all of these different platforms. And in addition, there are significant numbers of independent media outlets online, almost exclusively, who are doing investigative reports of police misconduct. And this might actually have, I think, a magnifying effect if it has the potential to have a magnifying effect if it's successful. So if you take the example of the case of Ivan Golunov, a Medusa journalist who was detained because he had drugs planted on him, there was a huge upswell of support for Golunov. And eventually the police officers who planted the drugs were I believe, fired, and at the very least were sort of investigated. And so when people see the result of these kinds of activities, they may be more inclined to participate in them. So they kind of have a magnifying effect. And then finally, another goal of a lot of these organizations is just simple information transparency and accessibility. For those of you who study the court, you all know that you can go on the Judicial Department's website and get court statistics. But if you've ever done that or tried to search on the court docket or any of these kinds of things, you know that getting information is really, really a challenge. It takes a long time to really figure out how to navigate these. There are various information projects that have tried to make these much more user-friendly. So Dostoevsky is a new website that takes every single article of the criminal code and gives the basic statistics in a very user-friendly and readable way, and sort of does it over time. Infometer takes all of the requirements of the open transparency and open government laws, puts them into a checklist, and reviews state agency websites. Открытая полиция has been very focused on making police statistics and information about the police public. So all of these are sort of working together to make information available to citizens who might want to hold the police accountable. So I began this talk thinking about the fine line that authoritarian regimes might have to walk between keeping law enforcement loyal while also maintaining the illusion of accountability. But I also think that there's another fine line that the Russian state will have to walk in the coming years with regard to its relationship with civilian oversight and citizen control, not only of the police, but throughout society. The increasingly harsh restrictions on civil society activity by the state have resulted in many ways in these more democratized and creative and dynamic forms of oversight that we're seeing that I've highlighted today. But the fact of them being more democratized, again, little d, democratized, not to suggest that the entire system is going to democratize, but these more grassroots approaches are by nature just harder to control. They involve more people over more space and in space that's difficult to regulate. On the other hand, the fact that these accountability measures, these grassroots approaches largely use accountability measures that have been established by the state, which are then superpowered by technological know-how and advances like these kinds of complaint generators, means that the state can't readily shut down a lot of these activities without limiting its own access to information from below and undermining the appearance of providing transparency and accessibility to citizens. So the state is going to be in a little bit of a bind in trying to figure out how to deal with these kinds of activities. And as there's appeared to be a more repressive turn in the police power of the state over the past several months, it'll be interesting to see how this works out. It's kind of an ongoing issue that is something to be noted by Russia watchers, including you and myself. So thank you again. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you again for coming at this really busy time of the semester for all of you. I look forward to your questions and the discussion that will follow. I'll just go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Sanhi for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Lauren. It was a very useful and helpful a summary of the different strategies of the civil society in today's Russia and how they respond to the police abuse and the police activities that is ongoing. We have one question, but before I go into deliver the questions from the audience, so audience members, you can use the Q&A tab to type your questions or comments, and I'll be moderating those questions. I have one quick follow-up, maybe a question to your presentation. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about like the difference between this grassroots civil society, like Ovid Info, that are doing this oversight activities on their own, organized by themselves, sort of against the state and against the police department, and also the so-called the official public policy police council that is kind of established by the law and by the state to officially oversight the police. Is there any kind of overlapping between those two groups? If there are, like, who are they and what are their motivations? And if they're not really overlapping, are they genuinely antagonistic in their oversight activities? So that was like the quick follow-up question. I kind of wanted to understand where they stand again, like in relations to each other, and also like the response coming from the state to these grassroots oversight activities. I think it has been kind of becoming more severe with the foreign agent law. They kind of give the level and not really ban the activities of these organizations, but by designating them as foreign agents, they are really controlling and really demand the scrutiny of their activities to be reported every time they do something. So what was the interaction between these grassroots activities and the state response, like more severe and controlling responses to those organizations? But I think there is some kind of room to breathe for these organizations, as you talked about. So I just want to hear more elaboration on that.
Yeah, thanks. Those are really, really great questions. So in terms of the overlap between the official and unofficial oversight organizations, there isn't a lot. So I wouldn't say that they're antagonistic towards each other. I think they're doing wildly different things. So the police public councils are doing a lot of sort of public outreach, PR, that sort of thing. And they're staffed often by people who are not anti-state. And I wouldn't necessarily categorize the people who are doing oversights in the grassroots level as being anti-state. I think part of the mistake we often make is to sort of say like, okay, anybody who's working in a state organization is pro-state and anybody who's working outside of a state organization is anti-state. And I don't think that's true. I think, everybody's sort of just trying to make the situation better in whatever things that they're interested in. And so I've talked to a number of the police public counsel people, and I think that they very much see their role as helping the police, even though their role is technically oversight and it's outlined in the law. They just don't do a lot of the active oversight of the police, though they do like inspections and they do sit in on meetings with the public, between the public and the police and that kind of thing. So I think they're just doing really different things. There are oversight organizations. The ONK oversees prisons, which is a totally different area. But there have been some increasingly harsh that is an area that civil society activists have been very interested in being part of monitoring processes. You have a lot of access to prisons if you're a member of the ONK, and that's the Общественная наблюдательная комиссия. And they have actually had regulations passed that say that if you are designated a foreign agent or work for a foreign agent organization, that you cannot be a member of the ONK. And so there are ways that the state, if it wants to, or if it feels that somebody is particularly troublesome, that you could eliminate their ability to get into these more official organizations. But 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. And so there were a lot of civil society activists in these more official state organizations while still kind of maintaining their independent civil society activism. On your second question about the sort of back and forth of the state response to grassroots activity, I think you're right. I think there is room to breathe here. In part just because as it is sort of more grassrootsized or democratized, it's just a lot harder to say to an individual citizen, you as an individual citizen of Russia cannot make a complaint about the police, right? That if they close that door, then we're talking about a very different kind of regime than it wants to portray itself to its own citizens. And so one of the best quotes from my interviews was about this exact thing. And he was like, okay, so they shut down, and in Russian, as you all know, there are like 5 different words that you can use for this exact thing. So if they shut down общественный control, then we'll do гражданский control. And if they shut that down, we'll do народный control. And at some point, it's just going to be me as a citizen. What power do they have to tell me that I can't make a complaint as a citizen? And so I think that really sort of exemplifies the spirit behind what I'm thinking of when I talk about grassroots oversight, is that it really is about individual people doing small things to hold the state accountable rather than larger campaigns, but like in addition to these kinds of larger campaigns, some of which are undertaken with state support. So the Moscow-Helsinki group worked really closely with the police in doing station monitoring. And so, it's not, I think we tend to do this like, well, you're either in the opposition or you're not in the opposition. You either don't like Putin or you do like Putin, or you're with the regime or you're not. And I think the reality is just much more complicated in terms of motivations. And if I were to boil down the motivations, it's really about like wanting to see the system work better.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for the detailed answer. That really answered my questions. So we have a couple of questions from the Q&A tab. So first from Julia Petkova. Thank you very much for your interesting talk and presentation. How would you describe the problem of secrecy and publicity in police work? And existing oversight activities you've mentioned? In other words, how would you describe the distinction between different institutional mechanisms of censoring the information which is supposed to be shared with the public and another institutional claim for police forces to be transparent. Could you please reflect on this more relating to Russian context?
Yeah, Yulia, that's a great question. It's a problem worldwide. So I'm happy to reflect on it in the Russian context, but I think that everywhere around the world, police are very protective of themselves. And so they really want to make sure that the public has the least amount of information that it possibly can, because they don't want this kind of oversight. And so, I think in the Russian context, it's not that different actually from anywhere else, where it's always a fight and it depends on the institutional mechanisms that are available. And so, in the US, we have FOIA requests, and we have other kinds of ways that we can get information from the police. And so part of this is, using, a lot of it, I think, is using what's in the law. The best strategies are using what's in the law to say, hey, you actually then have to provide me with this. And I can give a personal example that I was shocked when I was writing my book about human trafficking. I wanted all the statistics and I couldn't find them. And so I wrote to the judicial department, and in the designated 30 days, they got back to me with the statistics. And I was quite frankly, shocked. But I think that this attentiveness to quantitative indicators and bureaucratic assessment that we see makes it so that lower level people are often more willing to share things that you would think that they would want to keep secret, as long as it doesn't sort of cross over into reflecting in a bad light. And so I think this is a constant tension between the public and the police of how much information to release, what kind of information to release, and how can it then be used against us. And so this is one of the main trajectories of a lot of these organizations, is just finding information, making it user friendly, and insofar as they're able to use the law to do that, that's the mechanism that they lean on. So I don't know if that's a full answer to the question, but I think it is. It's really about using the legal bases that they can in order to get what they want from an institution that is closed and secret and doesn't want to share.
We had actually one question during the presentation. So if you were to draw a rough comparison, what US law enforcement agencies correspond to Russian law enforcement, what would they be? So there are some, I think police force would be basically police, but could you maybe describe some of the security forces from Russia that could be kind of correspond to the agencies in the United States?
Yeah, so it's a hard comparison to draw. I think, if we sort of just take the everyday policing, Russian everyday policing is divided into multiple smaller divisions within the MVD, which is the overall police. And so, whereas in, for example, the United States, all the police are just police. They do traffic stops, they respond to crime, they respond to calls. So they're much more generalist than Russian police. One of the ways that authoritarian regimes do their sort of organize their security forces is often in this sort of fragmented way, so that there are different lines of loyalty between them, and that if any of them sort of get out of line, they can be used against each other. And we've seen that a lot of times in the past in Russia, where the investigative committee is investigating the procuracy, who's investigating the FSB, who's and so, it keeps everybody guessing a little bit, and it makes sure that they stay loyal. It's, I think it's the other thing that we see in Russia that we don't see in the US is the division of investigative responsibility. So in Russia, this is an entirely separate agency, whereas in the United States, a police force, there are detectives within particular police stations, and they do local detective work, and you kind of get promoted to be a detective, but it's not an entirely separate organization. And I think that And, you know, in Russia, it's even more complicated because you have the investigative committee for certain crimes, but you also have detectives in the MVD for other crimes that are less serious. And so you have this inherent tension in sort of who has the power to do these things. And prior to that, it was in the procuracy. And so it's, this, I think, is part of the way that an authoritarian regime approaches the organization of policing and security in ways that we don't necessarily see in a democratic country like the United States. And so I know that's like a little bit of a punt, Alexei, but there are a variety of differences that I think are really important to consider in terms of the political context and the advantages that are gained by fragmenting the law enforcement services for an authoritarian regime. And then one more quick thing on that is that the United States doesn't really have a national police force in the same way that Russia does. So the hierarchy is not, there is a national level police and FBI, but they don't have any impact on local level policing. The US has, you know, something like 30,000 police departments that are all engaging in their own policing stuff with their own priorities and their own hiring requirements and all that kind of stuff. So it's, the structure itself is extraordinarily different as well.
Mm-hmm. We have another question from Milos. Many citizens and civil society organizations use similar tactics and cross-border cooperation in Eastern Europe and globally. Are there examples of this international oversight help in civil society in Russia? Similarly, are there examples on the state side in addition to the ECHR or some bad faith oversight cooperation between authoritarian regimes just for show?
This is a great question. So this is actually something that I'm thinking a lot more as I was looking for a website to get the logo of the Открытая полиция. I typed in openpolice.org, and it turns out that there is an entire organization that's doing exactly what OVD Info is with its generators in the United States. It's got a form, you can generate a complaint, it has a list of all of the different police departments, it will identify which police department you need to send it to and the person and the way that you send it. And so I think there is a ton of learning. And one of the things I'm really interested in that I haven't gotten to the bottom of is sort of like where this originates. And so there are court monitoring programs that are international. They do a bunch of different things. Some of them focus on political trials. Some of them focus on sort of ordinary monitoring like we see in Russia. This is a big thing in Eastern Europe. There's an entire Polish organization called Court Watch that has done this. The original monitoring movement of the police and the badges was in cooperation with Transparency International. So I do see a broader network of oversight and accountability. And I'm really glad you brought it up because I think it's one of the things that I've been thinking about a ton recently and thinking like, oh gosh, I really need to map this and figure out where everything is. And I think there's also a pattern, to answer the second part of your question, of authoritarian learning of these kinds of organizations for show. And I think it's part of a broader project. It's like sort of supersized in Russia, where like literally every agency has a public counsel attached to it. But it does also happen elsewhere. And it's part of both getting if you have a civil society that's restive and you want them to do things in a particular way, you can create these kinds of organizational forms to direct them in ways that are going to be useful to you. And of course, not every civil society group or activist is going to be like, yes, I'll work through the state. But by creating those possibilities, and as in Russia, sort of clamping down on the ones that don't sort of funnel in those directions, you can kind of bring civil society under control a little bit. And so I think that is a pretty common authoritarian tactic of co-optation of civil society actors. And as I mentioned in the early part of the talk, I think that insofar as the state, and I'm kind of talking about the state in a very broad sense here, but like insofar as the state can exercise control over the control, I think they are fairly willing to tolerate a lot of this activity because it's useful to them. And that's one of the things that I think we haven't really thought as much about. Like there is definitely use in having some low-level people do functions that the state just doesn't have the capacity to do, but that also continue to keep the agencies in line as they need to be kept in line.
Okay, so maybe I will ask one final question from my end. So this maybe is kind of a question that I should not ask to a political scientist, but I wanted to ask some kind of future prospect of this whole interaction between the state and society in Russia. So I can see that these like grassroots oversight organizations that want to monitor broadly and to seek for more information transparency in law enforcement activities in Russia, they're not like, I think essentially started from political nature, but still, I guess a lot of the overall environment in Russia make them political institutions and political nature movements. Do you think, is there a possibility that this sector of civil society, and I think it is, of course, infused with other sectors of civil society in Russia that are anti-regime and political. So would there be a room for these organizations and civil society and individuals maybe that could be formed as a kind of a force against the state and against the authoritarian regime? Or and also at the same time, in addition to that, do you think because you said that to a degree, state wants these kind of activities and this kind of information transparency coming from the grassroots organizations because of the importance of significance of transparent information in running the government. Do you see any kind of possibility of maybe desirable cooperation between these two sectors?
So yes, don't ever ask a political scientist to predict the future. So I think we're in at this moment, we're in kind of an inflection point of state-society relations in Russia. And I don't really have a good answer about where that's going to go. I think that the last round of foreign agent laws and the proposed ban on conducting educational activity outside of a university setting could really hit this sector quite hard. I think one of the motivating impulses for a lot of these organizations is essentially like, teach the people how to fish, right? And then they'll be able to take care of themselves. And so getting information out and teaching people how to defend themselves or what to do or how to file a complaint or, all of these kind of educational activities, that could take a hit if that ends up becoming law. On the other hand, I would never count Russian civil society out. I think Russian civil society is incredibly dynamic, adaptive, and really creative. I just, you see all of these new forms of engagement that use technology and that use the internet and all these kinds of ways to get people engaged in holding the state accountable and engaged in other ways too. But I think it's the democratized nature of technology, I think, makes this a challenge for the state to regulate. And, you can see that the state is trying to clamp down more on social media. The state is trying, by using, extremism as a way to punish people who are not sort of following what they would like or doing what they would like. But I also, I think on your sort of last point about desirable cooperation, I think there's a lot of room for that. I think that the example of the Citizen and Police Initiative, the Moscow Helsinki group got a presidential grant and worked alongside the National Police Public Council, worked in local areas, and did this kind of monitoring activity with all of these groups. And in many cases, the police actually find it useful too, because if they're constantly asking for more resources. If you take like your most local police station, like the one that doesn't have a bathroom that's available to people, or pens and paper, like they're not happy that they're under-resourced either. And so it is actually helpful for them to have these kinds of monitoring reports that are kind of have the stamp of approval from above, that then allow them to ask for more resources. And somebody was telling me, this is a court monitoring thing, but somebody was telling me about how like they wrote to the court because they didn't have a flag flying. And they were like, well, there's no money in the budget for flags. And so we're going to, we're going to use your report that you've written here about how we're disobeying the law to advocate for more money for flags in our next budget request. Like, it's a very simple and kind of silly thing, but it also, I think, shows that there is a lot of potential for cooperation. On the other hand, the democratized nature of this kind of activity is in many ways its own downfall, right? Like, so there is a reason that organizations become institutionalized, and it's because people need to get paid for their time, and people need to, have some kind of organized way to do what they're doing. You can't rely indefinitely on volunteer labor. And so I think, and then I think there was one other piece of your question about whether this can be a political force. And I think, it depends on whether the issue of policing itself becomes a more political issue. And I think you're seeing a little bit of that movement, given the really harsh police response to the Navalny protests in January and February, that there are increasing public statements and protests even about policing itself. And so, whether we see that moving in that direction, I think is an unknown. But monitoring was a huge piece of what caused the mass protests in 2011, right? Vote monitoring. And so it's not impossible that this could be an area of broader concern, in the same way corruption has been a motivating concern for protests over the past several years.
Thank you for the very thoughtful answer to my unwise question.
Oh, no, I don't think it was wise at all.
All right, so maybe it's time for wrapping up today's talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Lauren McCarthy. Thank you all very much for all the audience members for participating and sticking with us until the very end. I would like to make a note on the next event, which is on May 20th by Dr. Ben Noble on Bulldogs in the Duma, Executive Factionalism and Lawmaking in Russia. So today, we've dealt with the law enforcement body, police in Russia. In the next event, we're going to talk about the lawmaking institutions and practices in Russia. So if those who are interested in this topic, please come join us again on May 20th, and you can find more information on the Harriman website. Okay, thank you again, Lauren, and thank you, everyone. Yeah, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.